Hello, Patriots. And it is Monday, June 14th. And an update to your reality. Just wanted to make sure you still understand that we have a hand puppet acting as a president. That the sleepy back, mattress back Harris is still acting as vice president. Jim Hansen is still running the government with his Muppet Show. And characters like Buttigieg are now being considered to be replaced by Beaker or the chef. But other than that, everything is good. So I read this in the previous show, and I just want to make sure that those of you that are tuning in do get to hear it. It's a pretty interesting perspective piece from the website greatawakening.win. And I'll just read this perspective very quickly. So here we go. We're going to read today Federalist Paper number 70, and which just happens to be more about the executive branch. Always amazed at the timing of things. We started this thing back in January. I think that's when we began this. Maybe earlier. December, maybe. You never know where you're going to land. There was no way of knowing because we were moving between the daily commentaries that I enjoy giving and the Federalist paper. And here we arrive on Federalist paper number 70, the Executive Department Further Considered, which just seems very apropos considering the state of the union and the crisis in the presidential arm. Almost like God guided this perfectly. Amazing. So here we go. By the way, Kennedy was our 35th president. It's kind of interesting, too. Because today is 2 times 35, which is 70. Huh. That's kind of funny. I'm sure that's just a coincidence. We know how that goes. All right, Patriots, the Executive Department Further Considered is the title of this article from the New York Packet, Tuesday, March 18th, 1788. Author is Alexander Hamilton. To the people of the state of New York, there is an idea, which is not without advocates, that a vigorous executive is inconsistent with the genius of Republican government. The enlightened well-wishers to this species of government must at least hope that the supposition is destitute of foundation, since they can never admit its truth without the same time admitting their condemnation of their own principles. Energy in the executive is a leading character in the definition of good government. It is essential to the protection of the community against foreign attacks. It is not less essential to the steady administration of the laws, to the protection of property against those irregular and high-handed combinations which sometimes interrupt the ordinary course of justice, to the security of liberty against the enterprises. Every man, the least conversant in Roman story, knows how often the Republic was obliged to take refuge in the absolute power of a single man, under the formidable title of dictator, as well as against the intrigues of ambitious individuals who menaced the conquest of the destruction of Rome. Well, in that one sentence, Patriots, our founding fathers just spoke of this current time in history. Enemies foreign and enemies domestic. Continuing, there can be no need, however, to multiply arguments or examples on this head. A feeble executive implies a feeble execution of the government. A feeble execution is but another phrase for a bad execution, and a government ill executed, whatever it may be in theory, must in practice be a bad government. Taking it for granted, therefore, that all men of sense will agree in the necessity of an energetic executive, it will only remain to inquire where all the ingredients which constitute this energy, how far can they be combined with those other ingredients which constitute safety to the Republican sense, and how far does this combination characterize the plan which has been reported by the convention? The ingredients which constitute energy in the executive are first, unity; secondly, duration; thirdly, an adequate provision for its support; fourthly, competent powers. Now, I just want to point out that in this previous paragraph, or two previous paragraphs back, what was pointed out is the feeble government. Right now, what we are witnessing is a feeble government, a government that has no legs, no power, no nothing. And you'll notice why that's happening, because there is a feeble executive. Because the entire idea of this coup was to create a feeble executive so that ultimately the government of the United States would be so feeble that foreign powers would be able to get control of the United States and then roll us into a one world global technocracy run by corporate techno powers and banking elites, also known as the NWO, facilitated with their primary agenda, which was fake climate change nonsense, fake climate change science, and a new God, all driven by Human 2.0. So there's your whole package. If you don't believe it, look around. Oh, and if you have questions about it, I think you can go get a free donut and get your shot. Just an idea. Continuing, the ingredients which constitute safety in the Republican sense are first, a due dependence on the people; secondly, a due responsibility. Those politicians and statesmen who have been the most celebrated for the soundness of their principles and for their justice of their views have declared in favor of a single executive and a numerous legislature. They have with great propriety considered energy as the most necessary qualification of the former, and have regarded this a most applicable to power in a single hand, while they have with equal propriety considered the latter as best adopted to deliberation and wisdom. That's interesting. We just did wisdom earlier in previous show. Nice word. And best calculated to conciliate the confidence of the people and to secure the privileges and interests. That unity is conducive to energy will not be disputed. Decision, activity, secrecy, and dispatch will generally characterize the proceedings of one man in a much more eminent degree than the proceedings of any greater number, and the proportion as the number is increased, these qualities will be diminished. This unity may be destroyed in two ways, either by vesting the power in two or more magistrates of equal dignity and authority, or by vesting it ostensibly in one man, subject in whole or in part to control or cooperation of others in the capacity of counselors to him. Of the first, the two councils of Rome may serve as an example. Of the last, we shall find examples in the constitutions of several of the states. New York and New Jersey, if I recollect right, are the only states which have instructed the executive authority wholly in a single man. Now remember, Patriots, this was a time of debate of the new Constitution. And listening to the debates around that time, we are aware that there was discussion of whether to have a single executive or to have it be a shared executive or a council of wise men, so to speak. And so you've already heard the reference, which our founding fathers are so deeply read in the history of what we would call the ancient histories, ancient Rome, and all of the failures and challenges that were faced by those forms of governance. So this here is an example of this discussion that we're going to continue. The experience of other nations will afford little instruction on the head. As far, however, as it teaches anything, it teaches us not to be enamored of plurality in executive. We have seen that the Assyrians, on an experiment of two praetors, were induced to abolish one. The Roman history records many instances of mischiefs to the republic from the dissensions between the councils or consuls and between the military tribunes, which were at times substituted for the consuls. But it gives us no specimens of any peculiar advantage derived but to the state from the circumstances of the plurality of those magistrates, until we advert to a singular position in which the republic was almost continually replaced, and to the prudent policy pointed out by the circumstances of the state, pursued by the consuls of making a division of the government between them, the partisans engaged in a perpetual struggle with the plebeians for the presentation of their ancient authorities and dignities. The consuls were generally chosen out of the former body, were commonly united by the personal interest they had in the defense of the privileges of their order. In addition to this motive of a union, after the arms of the republic were considerably expanded the bounds of its empire, it became an established custom with the consuls to divide the administration between themselves by a lot, one of them remaining at Rome to govern the city and its environs, to the other taking the command to the more distant provinces. This expedient must, no doubt, have had great influence in preventing those collusions and rivalships which might otherwise have embroiled in peace of the republic. So just a quick piece on that to clarify. The plebeians is the council of the people, and the consuls was the leadership group that oversaw Rome, and they were elected, the consuls were elected from the plebeians, and in later years, the consuls that came together were then divided up so that there wasn't a consul all in one place, but they put them out to their outer regions to rule together. So essentially what they did is they turned the consul, which was a group, into an executive single person in Rome, and they used their body of consuls spread out among the territories of Rome so that each territory ended up with a representative of the consul, which was effectively the same as having a president in each consul, but only difference is a president that wasn't elected by the people but was representative of the people. And so the debate right now in this the debate that's going on right now in this discussion is the debate of whether we should have a single executive, a shared executive like a dual magistrate, or a consul like Rome. And the argument is showing that there really isn't any benefit to consul. In fact, putting consuls together leads to potential rivalries and people seeking to outwit the other. You create more problems than you solve. But quitting the dim light of historical research, attaching ourselves purely to the dictates of reason and good sense, we shall discover much greater cause to reject than to approve the idea of plurality in the executive under any modification whatsoever. Those two words, patriots, reason and good sense, would be great words to get back in our country again today because they are missing in our dialogue, in our existence. Hence the continuing. Wherever two or more persons are engaged in a common enterprise or pursuit, there is always danger of difference of opinion. If it be a public trust or office in which they are clothed with equal dignity and authority, there is peculiar danger of personal emulation and even animosity. From either and especially from all these causes, the most bitter dissensions are apt to spring. Whenever these happen, they lessen the respectability, weaken the authority, and distract the plans and operations of those whom they divide. If they should unfortunately assail the supreme executive magistracy of a county, consisting of a plurality of persons, this might impede or frustrate the most important measures of the government. In the most critical emergencies of the state, men often oppose a thing merely because they have no agency in planning it or because they may have been planned by those whom they dislike. But if they have been consulted and have happened to disapprove, opposition then becomes, in their estimation, an indispensable duty of self-love. They seem to think themselves bound to honor and by all the motives of personal infallibility to defeat the success of what has been resolved upon contrary to their sentiments. Men of upright, benevolent tempers have too many opportunities of remarking with horror to what desperate lengths the disposition of some is sometimes carried, and how often the great interests of society are sacrificed to the vanity, to the conceit, and to the obstinacy of individuals who have credit enough to make their passions and their caprices interesting to mankind. Perhaps the question now before the public may, in its consequences, afford melancholy proofs of the efforts of this despicable frailty, or rather detestable vice in the human character. That last piece would require people to be accountable. It sounds like even then they had to force people to be accountable to their actions and be aware of it. Continuing, upon the principles of free government, inconveniences from the source just mentioned must necessarily be submitted to the formation of the legislature, but it is unnecessary and therefore unwise to introduce them into the constitution of the executive. It is here too many, too, that they may be most pernicious. In the legislature, promptitude of decision is oftener an evil than a benefit. The differences of opinion and the jarrings of parties in the department of the government, though they may sometimes obstruct statutory plans, yet often promote deliberation and circumspection and serve to check excesses in the majority. When a resolution, too, is once taken, the opposition must be at an end. That resolution is a law, and a resistance to it punishable, but no favorable circumstances palliate or atone to the disadvantages of dissension in the executive department. Here they are pure and unmixed. There is no point at which they cease to operate. They serve to embarrass and weaken the executive of the plan or measure which they relate from the first step to the final conclusion. They constantly counterattack those qualities in the executive which are the most necessary ingredients in its composition, vigor, and expedition, and that without any counterbalancing good, in which the energy of the executive is the bulwark of the national security, everything would be to be apprehended from its plurality. Okay, there's a couple of key things there worth mentioning. We're discussing the frailty of the executive if you start to make it a plural office, meaning one or more than one person. And we're noticing that, and what they're pointing out is that as legislatures debate things and make law, the last thing you want to do is then pass that on to an executive council or consul, as the Romans would call it, in which they would be debating the outcome of a law that was passed by the legislative branch. The executive needs to be pure in its thought. It needs to be aligned in its thinking. Now, what we have witnessed under President Trump is that you had a strong executive head, the president, surrounded by traitors that were constantly backstabbing him through leaks and other elements. And so we didn't have a pure executive council. What we had was very much Romanesque, which was a consul of people, not really people. There's a donkey's backside would be a better term for that. And who were stabbing the executive and the will of the people in the back. Understand that. These people would have carried knives if they thought they could get away with it. And that's who was surrounding POTUS the entire time. Oh, a little footnote here for you. Every one of POTUS's faith leaders, and at one point or another has closed their churches. Just thought I'd mention that. That's the traitors and treason that surrounded our executive. Continuing, it must be confessed that the observations apply with principal weight to the first case, suppose that is to the plurality of magistrates of equal dignity and authority, a scheme that the advocates for which are not likely to form numerous sects, but they reply, though not with equal, yet with considerable weight, to the project of council, whose concurrence is made constitutionally necessary to the operations of the ostensible executive. That translates to, the observations made have been towards those of deceit in councils, that there are such things as benevolent councils, but in the end they succumb to the wills of men and they will be corruptible. Continuing. An artful cabal in that council would be able to distract and to enervate the whole system administration. If no such cabal should exist, the mere diversity of views and opinions would alone be sufficient to tincture the exercise of executive authority with a spirit of habitual feebleness and dilatoriness. But one of the weightiest objections to plurality in the executive, and which lies as much against the last as the first plan, is that it tends to conceal faults and destroys responsibility. Responsibility of two kinds, to censor and to punishment. The first is more important than the two, especially in the elective office. Man in public trust will much oftener act in such a manner as to render him unworthy of being any longer trusted than in such a manner as to make him obnoxious to legal punishment. But the multiplication of the executive adds to the difficulty of detection in either case. It often becomes impossible amidst mutual accusations to determine on whom the blame or the punishment of a pernicious measure or a series of pernicious measures ought really to fall. It is shifted from one to the other with such dexterity and under such plausible appearance that the public opinion is left in suspense about the real author. The circumstances which may have led to any national miscarriage or misfortune are sometimes so complicated that where there are a number of actors who may have had different degrees or kinds of agency, though we may clearly see upon the whole that there has been mismanagement, yet it may be impractical to pronounce to whose account the evil may have been incurred is truly chargeable. Meaning, if you have a council of people, there's no accountability to the one. Very much what the socialists like to do. They like to spread it around everybody so they can hide within the crowd. Oh, our university system is so good at that too. I was overruled by my council. The council were so divided in their opinions that it is impossible to obtain their resolution at one point. That's a quote. These and similar pretexts are constantly at hand, whether true or false, and who is there that will either take the trouble or incur the odium of a strict scrutiny in the secret springs of the transaction. Should there be found a citizen zealous enough to undertake the unpromising task, if there happens to be a collusion between the parties concerned, how easy is it to clothe the circumstances with so much ambiguity as to render it uncertain what was the precise conduct of any of these parties. In other words, when you remove accountability, people can hide within the crowd. It becomes so convoluted that they will be able to hide behind the lies. That is exactly what Congress has done over and over, and what our current legislative branch is composed of primarily. In a single instance in which the governor of the state is coupled with the council that is in appointment to the offices, we have seen the mischiefs of it in the view of new now under consideration. Scandalous appointments to important offices have been made. Some cases, indeed, have been so flagrant that all parties have agreed to the impropriety of the thing. When inquiry has been made, the blame has been laid by the government on the members of the council, who, on their part, have charged it upon his nomination, while the people remain altogether at a loss to determine by whose influence their interests have been committed to the hands of so unqualified and so manifestly improper. In tenderest to the individuals, I forbear to descend to the particulars. It is, in other words, what happens in this is this is why bodies of legislatures are dangerous, because you'll notice that they'll point the blame at a council, but the council's not an individual, and there's no accountability to the council. So you'll say, for example, we need to have a hearing to investigate the council. Okay, and then what? Well, we've determined that the council was out of order. And then they find the scapegoat, whatever that scapegoat is, like the political opponent that they don't like, and they throw some blame on them without having to blame the council, and they just kind of do a quiet censor. And the public never knows truth. And after enough of this dumbing down of the public, the public just begins to give up, because there's never any accountability or justice. And that's exactly where we are. This whole discussion here is about the vulnerabilities of councils, and particularly focused on the executive, but also applicable to every other aspect of government. It is evident from these considerations that the plurality of the executive tends to deprive the people of two greatest securities they can have for their faithful exercise of any delegated power. First, the restraints of public opinion, which lose their efficacy, as well as the account of the division of the censor attendant on bad measure among a number, as well as account for the uncertainty on whom it ought to fail. And secondly, the opportunity of discovering with facility and clearness the misconduct of the persons who they trust, in order to either remove their removal from office or their actual punishment in cases which admit of it. In England, the king is a perpetual magistrate, and it is a maximum which has obtained for the sake of the public peace, that he is unaccountable for his administration and his person sacred. Nothing, therefore, can be wiser in that kingdom than the annex to the king a constitutional council, who may be responsible to the nation for the advice they give. Without this, there would be no responsibility whatever in the executive department, any idea inadmissible in a free government. But even there, the king is not bound by the resolutions of the council. Though they are answerable for the advice they give, he is the absolute master of his own conduct in the exercise of his office, and may observe or disregard the counsel given him at his sole discretion. But in a republic where every magistrate ought to be personally responsible for his behavior in office, the reason which in the British Constitution dictates the propriety of a council not only ceases to apply, but turns against the institution. In a monarchy of Great Britain, it furnishes a substitute for the prohibited responsibility of the chief magistrate, which serves in some degree as a hostage to the national justice for his good behavior. In the American Republic, it would serve to destroy or would greatly diminish the intended and necessary responsibility of the chief magistrate himself. The idea of a council to the executive, which has so generally obtained in the state constitutions, has been derived from the maxim of Republican jealousy, which considers power as safer in the hands of a number of men than a single man. If the maxim should be admitted to be applicable to the case, it should contend that the advantage on that side would not counterbalance the numerous disadvantages of the opposite side. But I do not think the rule at all applicable to the executive power. I clearly concur in the opinion, this particular, with a writer whom the celebrated Junius pronounces to be deep, solid, and ingenious, that, quote, the executive power is more easily confined with it in one, that it is far more safe there should be a single object for the jealousy and watchfulness of the people, and in a word, that all multiplication of the executive is rather dangerous than friendly to liberty. Meaning that if you start to disperse the power of the executive over a number of people, as we've already discussed, they can bury the responsibility and accountability to the people, and ultimately there isn't a single point of accountability for the nation. That's the point of the executive, or what they would call the chief magistrate, or what we call the president. A little consideration will satisfy us that the species of a security sought for the multiplication of the executive is attainable. Numbers must be so great as to render combination difficult, or that are rather a source of danger than of security. The united credit and influence of several individuals must be more formidable to liberty than the credit and influence of either of them separately. When power, therefore, is placed in the hands of so small a number of men as to admit their interests and views being easily combined in a common enterprise by an artful leader, it becomes more liable to abuse and more dangerous when abused than if it be lodged in the hands of one man. For from the very circumstance of his being alone, will be more narrowly watched and more readily suspected, and who cannot unite so great mass of influences as when he is associated with others. Decemvirs of Rome, whose name denotes their number, were more than dreaded in their usurpation than any one of them would have been. No person would think of proposition an executive much more numerous than the body. From 6 to a dozen have been suggested for the number of the council. The extreme of these numbers is not too great for an easy combination. For such a combination, America would have more to fear than the ambition of any single individual. A council to a magistrate who is himself responsible for what he does are generally nothing better than a clog upon his good intentions, are often the instruments and accomplice of his bad, and are almost always a cloak to his faults. Meaning that when you put a group of people together as a council, you are almost assured that they're going to be something they're going to be hiding from the public eye that they can do so better by playing off of each other and keeping people from seeing the transparency of truth in the individual. Last paragraph. I forbear to dwell upon the subject of expense, though it be evident that if the council should be numerous enough to answer the principal end aimed at the institution, the salaries of the members, who must be drawn from their homes to reside at the seats of government, would form an item of catalog of public expenditures too serious to be incurred for an object of equivocal utility. I will only add that prior to the appearance of the Constitution, I rarely met with an intelligent man from the states who did not admit, as a result of experience, that the unity of the executive of the state was one of the best of distinguishing features of our Constitution. Publius. End of Publius number 7 of Federalist Paper number 70. Right now, we exist in a strange state considering this article, this paper, number 70. We have two presidents at this point in time, and we have some sort of invisible hand keeping this government together, probably FEMA. The issue at hand is that we don't have a country that's truly functioning at this point in time. The executive is power, since it is an executive that was confirmed without all the states confirming the vote, only has legal jurisdiction at the distance of a 13-mile district, a 13-square-mile district known as the District of Columbia. That's the extent of his power. So one asks then is, why is it that he's able to get things affected across the nation? Because these agencies which exist within that realm are choosing to abide to his power within the realm of the 13 square miles, and therefore conspire to bring his agenda into the nation by extending that reach by proxy to their remote contacts across the states. This territory, this district, is not even part of the United States as a whole. It's not a state. It has no voting right. It is just a separate little entity that was created in the act. Its true power was given in the Act of 1871, and its alliances and allegiances have always been to Rome. One of the reasons that you see them desperately trying to turn it into being a 51st state is not because of votes. It's because this corporation that they're in is bankrupt and has no power. It doesn't exist in the United States. It therefore can be cut off from the United States, isolated, and left to die on its own and wither, which we all hope will happen. It is my true hope that we never return to D.C. as a nation. It's my true hope that we wrap that sewer with a wall and fill it with water and let everything in it drown like rats. It's my hope that that remains a memorial for generations to come of what happens when government runs amok and runs out of control. This whole paper here, Federalist Paper number 70, while focused on the executive and the importance of having a single head in the executive, which we can see witnessed right now. Our nation is divided. One president who's taken up residence in Mar-a-Lago, the other president who is a hand puppet, fake Biden, who tries to act like a president, stuck in a 13 square mile area. So there we have it. So we have two presidents. And you can see what happens in a nation. Imagine having a co-counsel as a president. Imagining of having a multi-person council. When you begin to have infighting, each one would grab their constituent areas and they would use them to fight one another, and we would end up with like warring kingdoms. Our founding fathers were very aware of this, and their insight was prescient. They understood exactly what needed to happen to secure the best possible route of success for the United States, and that was to have a single person as executive who would unite the country, or at least function as the single point of success or failure of the nation. In the days, weeks, and months ahead, our nation needs to reclaim its place as a country with one president. And for us to restore this nation, people need to start to take accountability for their actions and be participant citizens in a republic. That means not being blind, obedient slaves to fear and the media. That means starting to be awake. That means starting to be accountable. That means putting God in your heart for wisdom. And it means accepting the responsibility of actions taken. Even with all of this said, our greatest challenges are still lie ahead. We are at a crossroads in humanity, a crossroads for civilization as a whole. The world of transhumanism and humanism cannot coexist. They are mutually exclusive, not inclusive. And therefore we face a significant rift in our days, months, and years ahead. The only way we are going to accomplish this fight ultimately is to awaken people into this place of accountability. That each person must become their own executive of their life. They can't hide behind the crowd and be a sheep in amongst people, simply saying that they needed to do something because they were afraid of not being included, or prioritizing their life in terms of material wants and desires. They have to come to a place of accepting their role as a participant in an experiment that's greater than them, a country that was blessed by God, a country that sits and exists under the structure of moral law. And in so doing, they must be accountable to their daily actions as executives of their life. As our president is accountable to the nation, we each are accountable to the Constitution and to the overseeing of government as a government of we the people. Let us pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this time that we come together. We are blessed by the opportunity to discuss and to explore the deep wisdom that is passed to us and passed from our framers and given to us through our heart with all that you give us in each and every day. May we find that wisdom to guide us. May that wisdom awaken us. May that wisdom guide us in all that we do and all that we engage, to awaken the many that still walk in darkness and who have forgotten their role as being participants in a society where each is an executive, responsible and accountable to the Constitution and to you, and that each of our government officials are accountable to us and accountable to you. Let us never forget the power of a country built on the formation and the will of we the people, always accountable to our God Almighty. In the name of Christ Jesus, amen.